What's the biggest price you ever paid for someone else's lies? My uncle showed up late to the family reunion, asking my dad for $67 for groceries and gas. My mom made a joke about why he was always asking for money, and his daughter's eyes suddenly widened like she was going to cry. But she didn't, so I forgot about it. Until 3 weeks later. I was at the gas station at 2 a.m. when I saw my uncle's beat-up Hyundai at Pump 7. Through the window, I watched him arguing on the phone and clearly heard, "Please, leave her out of this. I just need another week." He was dripping sweat, and when he went inside, he bought $200 worth of scratch-offs and started frantically scratching them right there at the counter. That's when I started noticing patterns I'd never paid attention to before. Unc always knew exactly when Dad got his quarterly bonus or when Mom's tax refund hit. Then he'd show up within days, asking for money for car repairs or school supplies, and the amounts always seemed to increase around major sporting events. I began watching his daughter more closely. At our next family dinner at Olive Garden, she stared at her water glass while everyone ordered. "I'm hungry," she whispered. Unc's face was flooded with disappointment in himself. "You're always hungry," Aunt Becca muttered, flagging the waiter. "More free bread, please." The thing was, I'd seen her crushing 2 gas station hot dogs in the parking lot 20 minutes ago. Now she was acting hungry. But why? The really weird stuff started when I caught Unc going through my parents' mail during Easter dinner. He was photographing documents with his phone, and when I confronted him, he laughed it off, saying he was checking if they had the same mortgage company. 2 days later, I peeked into his car window and saw it was carpeted with losing lottery tickets, thousands of them sorted into bundles by date, and I started wondering how deep in debt he really was. I borrowed his phone to make a call and found videos in his gallery. His daughter in their bathroom mirror was practicing saying things like, "My tummy hurts so bad." Each time Unc's voice projected from behind the camera, "Go again. Try pinching yourself till you cry." In another video, he asked, "Did you see who offered to buy you food?" Only Cousin Janet. I airdropped the videos to my phone, thinking the little girl was getting abused. So the next chance I got alone with her, I gently sat her down. She was like 9, so I figured I could just get the answers out. But when I asked what was going on, she just told me, "Daddy likes to play games," and ran off. That's when I had enough. I decided to follow him to see if he really was going to the casino every night like I suspected. And when I saw him meet some dangerous-looking men in the casino parking garage at 3 a.m. exchanging something, I knew I had to act. I walked right inside behind him where he was betting amounts that made me dizzy, completely focused and nothing like the bumbling loser persona he showed our family. Breaking into his apartment the next morning felt wrong, but I was desperate for answers. I expected to find eviction notices and loan shark threats, but his place was almost obsessively neat. In his closet behind boxes of losing lottery tickets, I found a small safe. I guessed the combination using his kids' birthdays and found a safety deposit box key for a bank downtown inside. I knew whatever was in there would explain everything. And when I finally convinced the bank to open the box for me, my legs nearly gave out. There was a lottery ticket from 5 years ago worth $50 million, carefully preserved in protective plastic, but that wasn't even the shocking part. Underneath were receipts for everything. Mom's student loans paid in full, Dad's business debt that almost bankrupted us, Grandma's chemo treatments, medical bills for family members I didn't even know were sick. Every casino trip, every lottery ticket, every gambling debt was a lie to hide that he'd won $50 million. But it still didn't explain the borderline child abuse with his daughter. At the next family gathering, Uncle showed up with fresh scratchers visible in his pocket, maintaining his cover. I waited until the room went quiet and projected the videos of his daughter's hunger training onto the TV. The room exploded with shouting before the first video even finished playing. I watched my aunt's face twist from confusion to something uglier as she saw her husband coaching Riley to pinch herself until tears came. Dad jumped up from his chair and Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Tony stood near the kitchen doorway like someone had hit pause on him, his face showing nothing while everyone else yelled questions and accusations at once. Riley bolted from her spot on the couch and ran crying to hide behind Aunt Becca's legs, grabbing fistfuls of her mom's jeans. The second video started playing, and Tony's voice came through the TV speakers telling Riley to practice saying her stomach hurt, to make it sound more real, to remember which cousins offered food. My cousin Janet started crying because she was in that video, mentioned by name as someone Riley successfully got sympathy from. Uncle Mike was yelling about what kind of sick game this was, while Grandma sat frozen in her chair looking like she might throw up. Tony's voice cut through all the chaos with a calm that made my skin crawl. He said the videos showed safety roleplay, that he was teaching Riley how to recognize when she was actually sick versus just wanting attention. He explained it like he was discussing the weather, saying every parent should teach their kids to understand their own bodies and communicate needs properly. Nobody was buying it. I could see it in their faces, the way they looked at him like he was a stranger. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and started swiping to the photos I took at the bank. I held up the screen showing the lottery ticket in its protective plastic, the numbers clear, the date from 5 years ago visible, the amount at the bottom reading $50 million. Then I swiped to the receipts, one after another, showing anonymous payments that lined up perfectly with debts that had mysteriously disappeared from our family. The room went completely silent except for Riley's quiet crying. I kept swiping through the images and everyone crowded around to see. There was the receipt for Dad's business debt, the exact amount he owed before the collection agency suddenly accepted pennies on the dollar 3 years ago. There were Mom's student loan payments, every single one marked as paid by a third-party LLC. There were Grandma's chemo treatment bills with satisfied stamps and anonymous beneficiary listed. Dad's face went pale when he saw the debt amount because he recognized it instantly. He'd told me once that seeing that number almost broke him, that he thought he'd lose everything. Mom started crying quietly, her hand still over her mouth, tears running down her fingers. Aunt Becca was staring at the phone screen like it was showing her something from another planet. Tony had won $50 million 5 years ago and spent all this time pretending to be broke, pretending to need money, using his daughter as a tool to gather information and manipulate sympathy. Tony finally moved, grabbing his jacket from the coat rack near the door. He muttered something about needing air and not having to explain himself to anyone. His hand was on the doorknob when Aunt Becca's voice stopped him. She stepped away from Riley and blocked his path, demanding he stay and explain what the hell was happening. She wanted to know if the lottery ticket was real, if he'd really been lying to her for 5 years, if everything about their life was fake. Tony's face showed the first real emotion I'd seen since the videos started. A flash of anger mixed with something desperate. He pushed past her without answering and slammed the door hard enough to make the family photos rattle on the wall. The sound echoed in the silent room, and then everyone started talking at once again. But this time the anger was splitting in different directions. Aunt Becca whipped around to face me with fury blazing in her eyes. She started screaming that I had no right to break into their home and go through their private things no matter what I suspected. She yelled about violation of privacy, about destroying trust, about how I could have come to her first if I was so concerned about Riley. Her voice got louder with each accusation, and spit flew from her mouth as she called me names I won't repeat. She scooped up Riley, who was still crying, and headed for the door, pausing only to tell everyone she was done with this family and their judgment. The door slammed again, and suddenly I was left facing my parents, who looked completely torn. Dad's face showed gratitude and anger fighting for control. Mom was still crying, but she was also shaking her head at me like I was a kid who'd done something dangerously stupid. Dad started in on me before I could even process what just happened. He asked what I was thinking breaking into someone's apartment like a criminal. He wanted to know if I considered that Tony might press charges for breaking and entering. He paced back and forth, asking if I understood I could go to jail for what I did. I tried to explain about the coaching videos and how worried I was about Riley's welfare, about how the manipulation seemed to be getting worse. Mom cut me off mid-sentence, saying I should have gone to the authorities first instead of playing detective. She said there were proper channels for these concerns, and I'd bypassed all of them to do something illegal. Grandma finally spoke up from her chair, asking if Tony really paid for her cancer treatments, and when I nodded, she started crying too. The room felt like it was closing in on me as everyone processed what they'd learned and how they'd learned it. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying the confrontation in my head, seeing Riley's tears, hearing Aunt Becca's accusations, watching Tony's blank face. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those coaching videos and wondered if I'd made everything worse by exposing Tony so publicly. Maybe Mom was right about going to authorities first. Maybe I should have found a quieter way to handle this. But then I remembered Riley pinching herself until she cried on camera, and I knew I couldn't have stayed quiet. By the time morning light came through my window, I'd made a decision. Whatever happened to me legally, whatever consequences I faced for breaking in, I needed to make sure Riley was protected from further manipulation. Tony could press charges if he wanted. I'd deal with that. But I wasn't going to let him keep using his daughter as a tool. I called the CPS hotline at 8 in the morning. My hands shook as I dialed, and I had to try twice to get the number right. The intake worker who answered had a tired voice, but she listened carefully as I filed an anonymous report about the coaching videos and emotional manipulation. I described what I witnessed without mentioning the lottery money, because that seemed irrelevant to Riley's welfare. The worker asked detailed questions about Riley's physical safety, whether I'd seen any bruises or signs of neglect, whether the child had food and shelter. I explained that she seemed physically fine, but the psychological manipulation was clear in the videos. The worker said they'd assign a caseworker within 48 hours and asked if I could provide the videos as evidence. I said yes, and she gave me an email address to send them to. After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone, wondering if I'd just made things better or worse. My phone buzzed with a text around noon, and my stomach dropped when I saw Tony's name. The message was short and felt like something from a bad movie. It said, "Parking lot behind the grocery store, 6 p.m., come alone." I read it 3 times, trying to figure out if it was a threat or just a request to talk. The implied danger made my hands shake as I took a screenshot of the message. I sent the screenshot to my email and to my best friend with a note saying, "If anything happened to me, show this to police." It felt dramatic, but Tony had been lying to everyone for 5 years and using his daughter as a manipulation tool. I had no idea what he was capable of. I spent the afternoon trying to focus on work, but failing completely. Every hour that passed made me more nervous about the meeting. I showed up at 5:45 and parked where I could see the whole lot. My car was facing the entrance so I'd see Tony arrive. I kept my doors locked and my phone ready to call for help if needed. At exactly 6 o'clock, Tony's beat-up Hyundai pulled in and parked facing me about 20 feet away. He sat in his car for a minute before getting out slowly. I noticed he looked exhausted in a way his usual bumbling act never showed. His shoulders slumped and there were dark circles under his eyes. His clothes looked slept in and his hair was messy. This was a different Tony than the one who showed up at family gatherings pretending to be broke. This version looked worn down and real in a way that made me even more nervous about what he wanted to say. He walked over slowly and stopped about 3 feet from my driver's side window. I kept the door locked but rolled the window down halfway. Tony leaned forward with both hands on the roof of my car, and his voice came out quiet and tired. He told me those men I saw at the casino weren't criminals exactly, but they weren't legal either. They helped him buy up family members' debts from collection agencies at discount rates so he could settle them without anyone knowing it was him. If I kept digging and asking questions, I might expose deals that could get people hurt, not just him, but the family members whose debts he'd quietly erased. The way he said it made my stomach twist because it sounded almost reasonable until I remembered Riley pinching herself on camera. I asked him straight out why he was using his daughter as a tool to manipulate everyone. Tony's face went hard, and his fingers pressed into the metal of my car roof hard enough that I heard it creak slightly. He said I didn't understand the full picture at all. The coaching helped him figure out which family members genuinely needed help versus who was just looking for handouts. He thought teaching Riley to read people and understand their motivations was a useful life skill she'd need anyway. My anger shot up so fast I felt it in my chest like pressure building. I told him that was complete garbage and he knew it. He wasn't teaching her life skills, he was teaching his 9-year-old daughter to manipulate and lie for his convenience. I said he was using her to gather information and test people's reactions so he could control every situation. Tony's jaw muscles tightened, and he pushed off my car roof hard enough to rock it slightly. He warned me to stop investigating before I made things dangerous for everyone involved. Then he walked back to his Hyundai without another word and drove off while I sat there shaking. I waited 20 minutes in that parking lot trying to calm down before I could drive safely. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Tony said about exposing deals and getting people hurt. Part of me wondered if he was telling the truth or just trying to scare me into backing off. Around 9 p.m., I decided I needed to see his actual behavior at the casino again, now that I knew what to look for. I drove to the casino and parked in a spot where I could watch the main entrance clearly. Cars came and went, but I didn't see Tony's beat-up Hyundai anywhere. At 11 p.m., I finally spotted him pulling into the lot and heading inside through the main doors. I followed at a distance and went through the entrance about 2 minutes after him. The casino floor was busy with people at slot machines and card tables. I scanned the room trying to spot Tony without getting too close. I also wanted to see if Nasser the security guard was working tonight, because he might have useful information. I walked slowly past the slot machines pretending to look at the games while really searching for either Tony or Nasser. Within 10 minutes, I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to find Nasser standing there with a serious expression. He pulled me aside toward a quieter corner near the bathrooms and asked what I was doing back here. His tone wasn't friendly exactly, but it wasn't hostile either, more like concerned. I explained briefly about the family situation and how Tony had threatened me earlier in a parking lot. I mentioned that I was trying to understand what was really going on with his casino visits. Nasser's face shifted to something that looked like pity mixed with worry. He told me quietly that Tony was on a list of people the casino watches because his betting patterns were strange. Tony would play big amounts but never seemed to actually win or lose much overall when they tracked it long term. The casino suspected he might be running some kind of scheme but couldn't prove anything concrete. Nasser suggested I might be in over my head with whatever was happening and that I should let professionals handle it instead of following Tony around. I thanked him and left the casino feeling more confused than before. The next day, I spread everything out on my kitchen table and started organizing what I knew into a timeline. I wrote down every time Tony had asked my parents for money and matched those dates against family events. I checked old text messages and calendar entries to figure out when Dad got his quarterly bonuses and when Mom's tax refunds typically hit. The pattern jumped out so clearly it made me feel stupid for not seeing it years ago. Tony always showed up within 3 to 5 days of major family money events. He timed his requests perfectly to catch people when they had cash available. He'd been tracking everyone's financial situations for years and planning his asks down to the week. I took photos of my timeline with all the dates and amounts written out. That evening, my phone rang and Dad's name popped up on the screen. I answered and heard defeat in his voice immediately. He said he and Mom had confronted Tony privately that afternoon and tried to get real answers. Tony admitted to helping family members financially over the years, but refused to explain the coaching videos or confirm the lottery win. He claimed the videos were taken out of context and that I had violated his privacy by breaking into his apartment. Now he was threatening legal action against me for the break-in and for showing the videos at the family gathering. Dad sounded tired and frustrated, like he didn't know what to believe anymore. I told him about the timeline I'd made and sent him photos of it. He was quiet for a long time before saying he'd look at it, and we'd talk more later. 2 days passed with me checking my phone constantly and jumping every time it rang. Then a call came from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a woman's voice introduced herself as Gabrielle Law from Child Protective Services. Her voice sounded professional, but had a warm quality that made me relax slightly. She explained she'd been assigned to investigate the report that was filed about Riley. She asked if I could meet to provide the evidence I'd mentioned in the anonymous report. I said yes immediately, and she gave me her office address and asked if I could come that afternoon around 3 p.m. I agreed, and spent the next few hours feeling anxious about what would happen. At Gabrielle's office, I sat across from her desk, while she pulled up a file on her computer. I showed her the coaching videos on my phone, and she asked me to email them to her secure work address. While the files transferred, I explained the context about Tony's hidden wealth and how he'd been using Riley to manipulate family members. Gabrielle watched both videos twice without saying much. She took notes about the specific phrases Tony coached Riley to say in the mirror. She wrote down details about how he instructed her to pinch herself until she cried and asked her to report back on who offered to buy her food. When the videos finished, Gabrielle looked up at me with an expression that was hard to read. She clicked her pen a few times and leaned back in her chair. Gabrielle told me the videos were definitely concerning and showed poor judgment on Tony's part, but they didn't cross the line into physical abuse or immediate danger that would warrant emergency removal. I felt my chest tighten because I'd expected her to do something right away, but she explained that CPS doesn't work like that. She said she'd schedule an interview with Riley at her elementary school with a counselor present, and she'd also do a home visit to see their living situation. The process would take time and wouldn't result in dramatic immediate action like I was probably hoping for. I asked how long, and she said at least a week or two, maybe more depending on her caseload. She could see I was frustrated and reminded me that jumping in too fast could actually make things worse for Riley if the family felt attacked and shut down completely. I left her office feeling like I'd accomplished something, but also like nothing was really happening yet. 2 days dragged by while I checked my phone constantly for updates that never came. Then Gabrielle called and asked if I could meet her at a coffee shop near Riley's school. I got there early and watched through the window as Gabrielle pulled up in a sedan with state plates. She sat across from me and pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages covered in neat handwriting. She'd interviewed Riley that morning with the school counselor present, and the girl had been polite and cooperative, but something felt off. Gabrielle said Riley used phrases that sounded oddly rehearsed, like she was reciting lines she'd practiced. When asked about her home life, Riley said everything was fine and her parents were nice to her. When asked about feeling hungry, she gave a long explanation about how sometimes her tummy felt empty, but other times it was just her imagination playing tricks. The counselor had noted that Riley seemed confused about what was pretend versus real, which worried Gabrielle enough to keep the case open. There were no signs of physical neglect, though. Riley was clean, well-dressed, at a healthy weight, and didn't have any visible injuries. Gabrielle said she'd move forward with the home visit and keep monitoring, but I could tell she was being careful not to overreact. 3 days after that meeting, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment with a law firm's return address I didn't recognize. Inside were notarized statements from someone named Jay Pritchard, showing anonymous charitable payments to various family members over the past 5 years. The documents listed my mom's student loans, my dad's business debt, my grandma's medical bills, and half a dozen other family expenses, all settled by a third-party company. There was a cover letter explaining that the payments were made with pure altruistic intent and demonstrated a pattern of generous family support. I realized Tony must have sent these trying to prove he was a good guy without actually admitting to the lottery win. I forwarded everything to Gabrielle immediately. She called me back within an hour and said the paperwork was interesting, but didn't change her assessment. She wasn't impressed by Tony's attempt to dodge the real issue with legal documents. The coaching videos were still the main concern, not whether he'd helped people financially. She scheduled a home visit for the following week and said she'd be looking at the whole family situation, not just the money stuff. My phone rang at 9 p.m. that same night, and Aunt Becca's name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but decided I needed to hear what she had to say. The second I picked up, she started screaming about how I'd humiliated their entire family and brought government workers into their lives over nothing. Her voice was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She insisted Riley was perfectly fine, and the videos were taken completely out of context. Tony had been teaching their daughter important life skills about recognizing real problems versus fake ones, and I'd twisted everything into something evil. She blamed me directly for any problems Riley might develop from this investigation, saying the trauma of being interviewed by strangers was my fault. I tried to explain about the coaching and manipulation, but she talked right over me. She said their family was private, and I had no right to involve outsiders in their business. The call ended with her telling me to stay away from them and hanging up before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling sick to my stomach, but also more sure than ever that something was seriously wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about those men I'd seen Tony meeting in the casino parking garage. The whole situation felt bigger than just family drama, and I needed to understand what Tony was really doing. I drove to the casino around 10 p.m. hoping to find Nasser again. I walked through the main floor, checking the security stations and slot machine areas where I'd seen him before. I was near the poker tables when a hand grabbed my elbow and pulled me toward a quiet corner near the bathrooms. Nasser looked annoyed and tired, like he'd just finished a long shift. He asked me what I was doing back here after he'd warned me to let professionals handle things. I told him about the CPS investigation and Tony's lawyer sending documents and how I needed to know more about Tony's actual relationship with those men. Nasser glanced around to make sure nobody was listening, then sighed like he was about to tell me something he shouldn't. He explained that Tony mostly puts on a show at the casino, betting big amounts at the tables but rarely actually cashing out anything significant. The casino had been tracking his patterns for months because something felt off. Tony would buy thousands in chips, play dramatically for a few hours, then leave with roughly the same amount he came with, give or take a few hundred. The men I'd seen him meeting weren't loan sharks like I thought. Nasser said they were more like gray market debt brokers who help people acquire other people's debts from collection agencies. It's technically legal, but the methods they use wouldn't hold up to much scrutiny. Tony apparently works with them to buy up family members' debts at discount rates, then settles them anonymously. The whole casino performance is just cover to explain where his money goes and why he's always broke. Nasser said Tony's been doing this for years, and the casino tolerates it because he's not actually cheating or causing problems. He warned me again that digging deeper could expose things that might hurt people, including my own family members who'd benefited from Tony's help. I drove home with my head spinning from this new information. Everything I thought I understood about Tony shifted completely. He wasn't a gambling addict at all. The whole thing was calculated performance art designed to maintain his cover while he secretly helped family members. I thought about all those bundled losing lottery tickets in his car and realized they were probably props he collected to make his story believable. He'd been building this elaborate lie for 5 years, playing the role of struggling gambler so thoroughly that everyone believed it, but that still didn't excuse what he was doing to Riley. Using his daughter as a tool to gather information and manipulate family members was wrong, no matter how generous his intentions were. The coaching videos proved he'd crossed a line from helpful to controlling. The next morning, I asked Dad if I could look through his old financial records. He seemed surprised but agreed after I explained I was trying to understand the full picture of Tony's help. We spent 2 hours in Dad's home office going through boxes of old paperwork and bank statements. In a folder labeled Business Debt 2020, I found a letter from 3 years ago showing a third-party company had settled his debt for pennies on the dollar. The company name was different from the ones in Tony's lawyer documents, but the timing matched perfectly. Dad admitted he'd never questioned it because he was desperate and drowning in debt at the time. A mysterious settlement felt like a miracle, and he didn't want to look too closely. Now we could both see Tony's fingerprints all over the deal. He'd been doing this for years, quietly buying up family debts and settling them while maintaining his broke gambler act. It was generous but also deeply controlling, and the fact that he tracked everyone's financial situations to time his interventions made it feel creepy rather than kind. Gabrielle conducted her home visit the following Tuesday. She called me afterward from her car and described what she'd found. Tony and Becca's apartment was clean and well-maintained, nothing like the disaster I'd expected. Riley's room was full of toys and books, her bed was made, and there were no signs of neglect or abuse. The kitchen had plenty of food, the bathroom was spotless, and overall the living situation looked stable. But Gabrielle had found something that raised new red flags. In Tony's home office, she'd spotted a notebook on his desk, with Riley's class schedule written out in detail, along with notes about which family members would be at which events. There were entries like, Mom's tax refund late March, Dad's bonus mid-June, Grandma's birthday party July, with check marks next to some and question marks next to others. It looked like a tracking system for monitoring family finances and planning Riley's performances. Gabrielle photographed the pages and said they'd be included in her report. The notebook proved the coaching wasn't random or about teaching life skills like Becca claimed. It was systematic manipulation. The formal CPS finding came back 2 weeks later as a services case rather than a removal case. Gabrielle called to explain what that meant. The evidence showed concerning behavior, but not severe enough to justify taking Riley out of the home. Instead, CPS was mandating family counseling sessions twice a month, parenting classes for Tony focusing on appropriate boundaries, and regular monitoring visits from Gabrielle for the next 6 months. Tony had no choice but to comply or face escalation to a more serious investigation. Gabrielle said she'd already contacted Tony and Becca to inform them of the requirements, and Tony had been furious about the intrusion. He'd argued that the coaching was misunderstood, and the notebook was just normal family planning, but Gabrielle shut that down. She told him the services were mandatory and non-negotiable, and if he refused to participate, she'd have to recommend removal. That got his attention fast. The first counseling session was scheduled for the following week, and Gabrielle would be doing her first monitoring visit right after that. She reminded me that this was progress even if it felt slow, and that the goal was to change behavior and protect Riley without destroying the family unnecessarily. That week, we gathered for dinner at my parents' house, and the silence felt thick enough to cut. Everyone picked at their food and avoided eye contact until Dad finally set down his fork and cleared his throat. He said from now on, if Tony wanted to help anyone in the family with money, it needed to be discussed up front. No more secret payments or anonymous debt settlements. Tony's face stayed blank, but I saw his hands tighten around his napkin. Mom jumped in before anyone could respond, and her voice shook a little as she explained that the hiding and manipulation had hurt worse than any financial struggle ever could. She said she'd rather face problems openly as a family than accept help that came wrapped in lies and control. Tony sat completely still through the whole thing, staring at his plate like he was trying to burn a hole through it. Aunt Becca didn't say a word in his defense, just kept her eyes down and moved food around without eating. After dinner, I caught Tony heading toward the door and blocked his path. I told him straight out that the coaching of Riley needed to stop completely, no more practicing lines or teaching her to fake anything. He started to argue back about life skills and reading people, but I cut him off hard. I said if I saw any proof he was still manipulating her, I'd push for CPS to remove her regardless of what it did to the family. His expression shifted into something I hadn't seen before, actual fear mixing with the calculating look he usually wore. He asked what exactly I wanted from him, and his voice came out quieter than normal. I laid out my terms one by one. End all coaching of Riley immediately. Tell the immediate family about the lottery win. Set up a proper trust fund for Riley's future with someone else managing it. Find real legitimate ways to help family members that didn't involve secrets or tracking their finances. Tony shook his head before I even finished talking. He said disclosing the full lottery amount would wreck the family dynamics and make everyone dependent on him for everything. But he agreed tentatively to stop coaching Riley and look into setting up a trust, as long as he kept control over how and when any information got shared with the wider family. The compromise left me feeling unsatisfied, but I was so tired from weeks of investigating and fighting that I couldn't push anymore. I agreed to give him a chance to make changes on his own before I exposed anything else, knowing Gabrielle's monitoring would catch him if he slipped back into old patterns. 3 weeks later, Gabrielle scheduled another home visit specifically to watch Tony interact with Riley. She called me afterward from her car and described what she'd observed. Tony wasn't doing the explicit coaching anymore, no more practicing lines or teaching Riley to pinch herself until she cried. But he was still prompting her responses in subtle ways, little cues and leading questions that guided her toward certain answers. Gabrielle had documented everything and issued a formal warning that any evidence of continued manipulation would result in immediate escalation of the case. She made it clear that Tony was on thin ice, and one more incident would trigger removal proceedings. A few days later, Tony texted asking me to meet him at a coffee shop across town. I showed up expecting another argument, but he looked different, less defensive and more worn down. He admitted that after winning the lottery 5 years ago, someone had tried to extort him by threatening to tell the whole family about the money. He'd paid them once to make the threat go away, and ever since then, he'd been paranoid about anyone discovering his secret. I asked to see proof because the story sounded convenient. Tony pulled out his phone and showed me a lawyer's letter from 5 years back, along with a police report he'd filed but never followed up on. The documents looked real enough, thin on details but legitimate. They explained at least part of his extreme secrecy and fear of exposure, though they didn't excuse the manipulation of Riley. That weekend, I sat down with Mom and Dad without Tony present to figure out how we wanted to handle things going forward. We talked for over an hour and came up with a family policy that felt workable. We'd accept that Tony had resources and had genuinely helped people over the years, but from now on, everything needed to be transparent. If he wanted to help someone, he had to ask directly, and we'd decide together whether to accept the help. No more secret payments, no more anonymous debt settlements, no more tracking people's financial situations without their knowledge. Dad said he'd tell Tony about the new policy at their next one-on-one meeting and make it clear this wasn't optional if he wanted to stay part of the family. Mom added that she'd rather rebuild trust slowly than go back to the way things were before, even if it meant struggling more financially. I felt relieved that we'd landed on something concrete, a real boundary that gave Tony a path forward without enabling his control issues. The whole situation still felt messy and incomplete, but at least we were moving in a better direction than where we'd started. The next week at work, I showed up late again because I'd been up until 3 a.m. reviewing documents Gabrielle had sent about the case. My boss caught me sneaking in through the side entrance and pulled me into her office without saying a word. She closed the door and sat down across from me with this tired look on her face. She told me I'd been late 3 times in 2 weeks and my project deadlines were slipping badly. I apologized and tried to explain about the family situation without getting into specifics, just saying there was a crisis with my uncle and his daughter. She listened and then said she was giving me one more chance to get back on track, but if I missed another deadline or showed up late again, she'd have to write me up officially. I promised to do better and got back to my desk feeling like everything in my life was falling apart at once. That same week, Tony reached out to Jay Pritchard, the lawyer who'd helped him set up those anonymous debt payments years ago. I only found out because Dad mentioned it during a phone call, saying Tony was finally doing something constructive about Riley's future. Jay specialized in trusts and estate planning, and he worked with Tony to create an independent fund specifically for Riley. The trust had a third-party trustee, not Tony or Aunt Becca, which meant they couldn't just drain it or use it for whatever they wanted. Jay built in mandatory counseling provisions and educational goals, taking a lot of the control away from Tony. When I heard about the structure, I felt relieved that at least Riley would have something secure no matter what happened with her parents. Around the same time, Riley started seeing a therapist who worked specifically with kids. Gabrielle had recommended someone, and Tony agreed to take her twice a week. The first 2 sessions didn't reveal much according to what Gabrielle told me later, just Riley giving rehearsed answers and acting like everything was fine. But in the 3rd session, something shifted. The therapist asked Riley about the games her dad taught her, and instead of the usual scripted response, Riley got quiet for a long time. Then she said the games felt scary sometimes, and she didn't like when Daddy got upset if she messed up her lines. It was the first time she'd expressed her own actual feelings without following a script, and the therapist noted it as real progress in her report to Gabrielle. I felt this huge weight lift when I heard that, because it meant Riley was starting to separate what was real from what was performance. 2 days later, I got a call from a police officer asking me to come down to the station to discuss a complaint. My stomach dropped and I immediately knew what it was about. When I arrived, the officer explained that Aunt Becca had filed a formal complaint about me breaking into their apartment. He asked me to walk him through what happened and why I'd entered their home without permission. I tried to explain about the coaching videos and being worried about Riley's safety, but the officer kept bringing it back to the fact that I'd committed breaking and entering regardless of my reasons. He said the district attorney would review the complaint and decide whether to press charges. I left the station feeling sick, realizing I could actually end up with a criminal record despite trying to help. The next day, the officer called me back, sounding confused but relieved. He said Tony had contacted them and told them he didn't want to press charges after all. Instead, Tony was proposing some kind of mediated agreement where I'd stay out of his home and he'd cooperate fully with CPS. The officer seemed happy to close the case without paperwork and said he'd set up one mediation session to make everything official. I was shocked that Tony was backing down, but also suspicious about what he was really planning. The mediation happened at a community center with a neutral person running it, some woman who did conflict resolution professionally. Tony and I sat across a table from each other while she explained the ground rules. We spent 2 hours hammering out specific boundaries. I agreed not to investigate him anymore, not to enter his home, and not to share any more information publicly without going through proper channels first. Tony agreed to maintain transparency with the immediate family about any financial help he gave, to continue cooperating with CPS, and to focus on Riley's well-being above everything else. The mediator wrote it all down and had us both sign it. The whole thing felt cold and clinical, but I knew it was necessary to avoid legal trouble and keep some kind of structure around Tony's behavior. A week later, Mom called me excited about something. She said a check had arrived in the mail for $15,000 with no return address or explanation. Her and Dad talked about it and decided to send it back with a note asking Tony to discuss any help directly first, instead of doing it anonymously. Tony actually called Dad that same evening, and they had this awkward but honest conversation about Grandma's upcoming medical expenses. Dad told him they appreciated the offer, but wanted to know what was happening instead of finding mysterious money. Tony seemed frustrated but agreed to be more open about it. The shift felt small but important, like we were actually establishing real boundaries instead of just talking about them. Tony followed up by meeting with Jay Pritchard again to set up a new system. Instead of sending anonymous payments or showing up with cash, Tony agreed to route all future family assistance through Jay's law office. Jay would create paper trails, send official letters explaining where money came from, and give everyone visibility into what was happening. It was more complicated and slower than Tony's old method, but it removed the secrecy and control that had caused so many problems. I heard about the new system from Mom and felt cautiously hopeful that Tony was actually changing his approach. Then Nasser called me out of nowhere one afternoon while I was at work. He said the casino had implemented a formal ban on Tony after their security team reviewed his patterns over the past few months. They'd noticed he was performing rather than actually gambling, and they didn't want someone using their space as a stage for whatever he was doing. Nasser said Tony had shown up that morning and been turned away at the door, and he'd looked really upset about losing his cover operation. I asked Nasser if Tony had said anything, and he told me Tony just muttered about needing to find new ways to maintain his secret. The casino ban forced Tony to figure out different methods since he couldn't use his regular gambling act anymore. At the end of the month, Gabrielle scheduled her regular check-in visit. She met with Tony and Aunt Becca at their apartment and spent time observing Riley. Afterward, she called me from her car to give me an update. She said there was measurable progress across the board. Riley was speaking more naturally and showing less rehearsed behavior. Tony had completed 4 parenting classes and was actually applying what he learned. The family counseling sessions were happening regularly, and both Tony and Aunt Becca were participating. Gabrielle told me she was cautiously hopeful about stepping down the monitoring level if the progress continued. She warned me not to get too comfortable because setbacks could still happen, but for now, things were moving in a better direction than anyone expected. The next few weeks, I threw myself into work like I was trying to make up for lost time. I stayed late 3 nights in a row finishing reports that had been sitting half done on my desk. My boss noticed when I turned in a project 2 days early, and she gave me this small nod of approval that felt bigger than it should have. By the end of the month, I'd cleared my entire backlog and even volunteered to help with the quarterly audit. The routine felt good in a way I hadn't expected. Showing up on time, focusing on spreadsheets and deadlines, eating lunch at my desk without checking my phone every 5 minutes. It was boring and normal and exactly what I needed after months of family chaos pulling me in every direction. My coworkers stopped giving me those concerned looks and started including me in regular office gossip again. The normalcy settled into my bones like something I'd forgotten I was missing. Sunday dinner at my parents' house happened 2 weeks later, and everyone showed up, including Tony and his family. We sat around the table, passing dishes and making small talk about nothing important. When the waiter came to take orders, Riley studied the menu for a minute, then pointed at the chicken fingers without looking at Tony first. She didn't do the hungry act or the stomach pain routine or any of the practiced behaviors I'd seen in those videos. She just ordered food like a regular kid and started coloring on the paper placemat while we waited. Aunt Becca's eyes got shiny, and she blinked fast a few times before excusing herself to the bathroom. Nobody said anything about it, but I caught Mom and Dad exchanging this look across the table. The meal continued without any weird performances, and Riley ate her food and asked for seconds on the fries. It was such a small thing, but it felt huge. After dinner, Tony caught my arm in the parking lot and asked if we could talk privately for a minute. We walked over to the side of the building away from everyone else and stood there in the cold while he shifted his weight from foot to foot. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and he admitted he got lost in the secrecy and control. The words came out stiff like he'd practiced them, but his face looked tired in a real way. He said he thought he was protecting everyone by keeping the lottery win hidden and by using Riley to figure out who really needed help. But he realized after all the confrontations and the CPS involvement that he was mostly protecting himself from having to be honest. He said he was sorry for putting Riley through the coaching and for manipulating the family even if his intentions started out good. It wasn't a full apology, and parts of it still sounded like excuses, but it was more honest than anything he'd said before. I told Tony I understood wanting to help family without making things weird about money. That part made sense to me even if I disagreed with his methods. But I said the manipulation, and especially the stuff with Riley, crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed easily. I accepted his partial apology because it seemed genuine enough, but I made clear that trust would take a long time to rebuild if it ever fully came back. We agreed right there in the parking lot that we'd keep contact limited and focused on making sure Riley was okay, rather than trying to force some closer relationship that neither of us really wanted. He nodded and looked relieved that I wasn't demanding more from him. We shook hands awkwardly and went back to our separate cars without any dramatic moment or big emotional scene. That night I sat on my couch and went through my phone carefully. I uploaded all the evidence I'd gathered to a secure cloud backup with a password only I knew. The coaching videos, the photos of receipts, screenshots of text messages, everything that documented what Tony had done. Then I went through and deleted the sensitive copies from my phone and my computer. I thought about sending everything to the local news or posting it online where thousands of people would see what he'd done. But every scenario I imagined ended with Riley's face plastered across social media and strangers picking apart her family's mess. The truth was known to the people who mattered. Mom and Dad knew, Gabriel knew, Aunt Becca knew, and Tony knew that we all knew. Making it public wouldn't protect Riley or help anyone. It would just turn our family drama into entertainment for people who didn't care about the actual kid at the center of it all. The next family gathering happened 3 weeks later for someone's birthday, and Aunt Becca showed up but kept her distance from me. She said hello politely when we crossed paths in the kitchen and asked how work was going in this formal voice that made it clear we weren't friends anymore. I answered just as politely, and we both moved on to talk to other people. Nobody tried to force us to hug or make up or have some big conversation about our feelings. The family seemed to understand that some relationships don't fully heal, and that's just how it goes sometimes. Aunt Becca stayed on her side of the room and I stayed on mine, and we were both civil enough that nobody felt uncomfortable. It became the new normal over the next few months. We could be in the same space without drama, but the warmth that used to exist between us was gone, and probably wouldn't come back. Mom mentioned during a phone call that she and Dad had started going to counseling together. Not because their marriage was in trouble, but because they needed help processing everything about Tony. She said they had these complicated feelings about the secret help he'd given them years ago. On one hand, they were grateful that Dad's business didn't go under and that Mom's student loans disappeared. On the other hand, they felt violated that Tony had been pulling strings behind their backs and treating them like charity cases without their knowledge or consent. Their therapist told them it was healthy to feel both gratitude and resentment at the same time, that they didn't have to pick one emotion and stick with it. Mom said the sessions were helping them figure out how to set boundaries with Tony going forward without completely cutting him off from the family. A few weeks after that, Jay Pritchard sent out an email to the whole family about Grandma's cancer treatment fund. He'd set up this transparent system where all the money for her medical expenses went through his law office, with monthly statements sent to anyone who wanted them. The statements showed exactly how much came in, where it went, and what bills got paid. It removed all the secrecy that had caused so many problems while still making sure Grandma got the help she needed. Dad told me he appreciated being able to see the numbers clearly instead of wondering where mysterious payments were coming from. Grandma seemed relieved too that she didn't have to feel guilty about accepting help from Tony when everything was out in the open now. My sleep schedule finally got back to normal after weeks of lying awake, replaying conversations, and worrying about what would happen next. I stopped waking up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, thinking about worst-case scenarios. My phone sat on the nightstand without me checking it every 20 minutes for crisis texts from family members. The constant adrenaline that had been running through my system for months started fading into something more like regular awareness. I could think about other things besides Tony and Riley and CPS investigations. I started watching TV shows again without my mind wandering to family drama. The obsessive edge that had taken over my life during the investigation period gradually smoothed out into manageable concern instead of consuming anxiety. Gabrielle called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said she was officially closing the active investigation phase of the case. She'd keep it open for services, which meant Tony still had to do the parenting classes and family counseling, but the intense monitoring would step down. She scheduled a 6-month follow-up check to make sure the progress continued. Before she hung up, she told me privately that the family's willingness to make actual changes instead of just defending Tony had prevented a much worse outcome. She said she'd seen cases where families circled the wagons and refused to acknowledge problems, and those situations usually ended with kids getting removed. Our family's messy honesty and willingness to set new boundaries probably saved Riley from foster care. I thanked her for everything she'd done and meant it. After we hung up, I sat there feeling this weird mix of relief and exhaustion, like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally let it out. Thanksgiving rolled around 3 months later, and I drove to my parents' house with my stomach doing flips about seeing Tony again. When he walked through the door carrying a store-bought pie, I immediately checked his pockets out of habit. No scratch-off tickets poking out of his jacket, no bulge from a wallet stuffed with losing lottery tickets. He greeted everyone normally and sat down at the table without making his usual rounds, asking about jobs or bonuses or tax refunds. The silence where his money requests used to be felt weird and uncomfortable, like when someone stops using a catchphrase you got used to hearing. Everyone noticed, but nobody said anything about it. We passed dishes around and made small talk about the weather and football, and Tony participated without the fake struggling act he used to put on. After dinner, Riley came up to me holding a piece of paper folded in half. She handed it to me and said it was from a real dinner, where she got to pick everything she wanted. I unfolded the crayon drawing and saw a stick figure version of her sitting at a table with a huge smile, surrounded by what looked like pizza and ice cream and French fries. The colors were bright and messy and kid-like, nothing rehearsed or coached about it. I told her it was really good and asked if I could keep it. She nodded and ran off to play with the other kids. When I got home that night, I stuck it to my refrigerator with a magnet, right at eye level where I'd see it every morning. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing small changes in how Tony interacted with everyone. He remembered my birthday without anyone reminding him and sent a text that just said happy birthday without asking for anything. At a family coffee meetup, he asked Dad about his work project and actually listened to the answer instead of steering the conversation toward finances. He showed up to help Mom move some furniture and didn't mention needing gas money for the drive over. The changes were so small that I wondered if other people even registered them, but I watched him carefully and saw family members responding differently. They started including him in conversations more naturally, instead of that guarded way everyone had been talking around him. Dad invited him to watch a game without Mom having to suggest it first. An envelope showed up in my mailbox in early December with Jay's law office return address printed in the corner. Inside was a quarterly report showing where Tony's charitable money had gone for the past 3 months. The list included the family help we knew about, Grandma's medical fund, but also donations to food banks and youth programs and addiction counseling centers. The amounts were significant, and the paper trail was clean and transparent. A note from Jay said Tony had asked him to expand the giving beyond just family situations, trying to find healthier ways to help people without the control issues. It felt like progress, even though I knew one report didn't prove permanent change. The family gathered at my parents' house 2 weeks before Christmas for a low-key dinner. Nothing fancy or planned out. Mom made spaghetti, and Dad told his usual terrible jokes that made everyone groan. Riley sat with her cousins at the kids' table, and they argued about which movie to watch later. Normal kid stuff without any weird performances. She ate her dinner at a regular pace and asked for seconds because she actually wanted them. Aunt Becca even laughed at one of Dad's jokes about a talking penguin, the first time I'd heard her laugh genuinely in months. The conversation flowed easier than it had since the whole situation exploded, people relaxing into normal family chaos instead of walking on eggshells. After dinner, Tony caught my eye and tilted his head toward the back porch. I followed him outside where the cold air bit at my face, and we stood there not talking for a minute. He mentioned he'd been seeing his own therapist every week to work through his control issues and his fear of everyone finding out about the money. He said it like he was telling me about a dentist appointment, just stating a fact without asking for credit or forgiveness. I nodded and said that was good, and we stood there a bit longer before heading back inside. Sitting in my apartment one evening a few days later, I realized I was watching TV without my brain constantly analyzing everyone's behavior from the dinner. For months, I'd been stuck in this mode where I picked apart every interaction looking for signs of manipulation or coaching or hidden agendas. Now I could think about other things, let my mind wander to work stuff or weekend plans or what to eat for dinner. The hypervigilance that had taken over my life during the investigation had finally eased back into normal family awareness. I still paid attention, and I still watched for problems, but it didn't consume every thought anymore. Gabrielle scheduled her 6-month follow-up visit for a Tuesday afternoon in January. She met with Riley privately first, then talked to Tony and Becca together, then reviewed all the documentation from the family counseling sessions and parenting classes. When she called me afterward, she sounded genuinely pleased with the progress. Riley was doing well in therapy and showing continued improvement in expressing her real feelings. Tony had completed all the required classes and was maintaining the new patterns of behavior. The family counseling was ongoing and productive. Gabrielle officially recommended case closure with the option to reopen if any new concerns came up, but she didn't expect that to happen. She thanked me again for reporting the situation, even though it had been messy and complicated, saying most families never get to this point of actual change. Spring came around and the family planned a barbecue at my parents' house for one of those first warm weekends. I showed up early to help Dad set up the grill and watched family members arrive over the next hour. Tony and Becca pulled up with Riley, who immediately ran to play with her cousins in the backyard. When it was time to eat, everyone lined up to make their plates. I watched Tony help Riley reach the serving spoons and ask her what she wanted without any of the weird coaching or performance. He just acted like a regular dad, making sure his kid had enough food, nothing more complicated than that. She pointed at the potato salad, and he scooped some onto her plate, and they moved down the line together, talking about whether she wanted a hot dog or a hamburger. Everyone was slightly better than they'd been 6 months ago. The boundaries were clearer now. People knew what to expect from each other. The vigilance continued quietly in the background, everyone paying attention but not obsessing. It wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but it was real, and it felt like something we could actually sustain long term. And that's basically where things ended up. Not perfect, but better than it started. Like the video if it was worth your time, subscribe if you're sticking around for more. I appreciate you being here, and yeah, see you next time.